This special COP28 Insights panel discussion is brought to you in association with Nedbank.
Join the bank that's best for your money. Nedbank. See money differently.
The 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28, takes place in just a few days in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and this year's conference will serve as the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. It will be the first detailed assessment of worldwide progress since its adoption and will aim to recalibrate efforts towards more effective climate action and address shortcomings. Welcome to this special panel discussion on COP28. I'm joined by Arvana Singh, the Head of Sustainable Finance Solutions at Nedbank CIB. On the line is Joseph Rohm, Partner at ERM, Sustainable Finance and Climate Change. Reitumetse Molotsoane, Head of Environment and Society at the National Business Initiative. And Justin Smith, Head of Business Development at the WWF South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Arvana, if I can start with you, let's look at what the main focus areas are, and there's already a lot of discussion and a lot of articles and reports going out of the global themes that global leaders across the world and economic leaders and social leaders and climate change protagonists, but also organizations and institutions are looking at to try and make sure that COP28 delivers on some fundamental issues. What do you think are the particular areas, especially where finance plays a role, that COP28 will look at?
Sure. In essence, there are four key themes which will be the objective of the COP this year, and namely the energy transition, climate finance, putting lives, livelihoods and nature at the heart of climate action, and mobilizing for inclusivity. With respect to the energy transition, there's an acknowledgement that many countries are behind in terms of tracking emissions and effectively slashing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And as such, there's an expectation to calls and pledges that will ultimately triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030 and effectively work with high carbon emitting sectors to rapidly decarbonize by engaging in technologies such as pushing low carbon green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and reducing methane. With respect to climate finance, this is an area which is anticipated to transform and scale in order to be able to meet the needs of financing the actual energy transition. And according to the United Nations, that global need is at about $4 to $6 trillion annually up until 2030. So a big call to mobilize and effectively transform the financial system to be able to meet this need. When we look at putting lives and livelihoods and nature at the heart, this really speaks to the why behind the climate transition and the call for action that's required, and highlights the impacts to the vulnerable to ensure that we can maintain a sustainable ecosystem and a sustainable planet. And lastly, mobilizing for inclusivity will focus on building on the youth envoy that was introduced in COP26 to bring in the voice of young leaders, but also indigenous leaders, as well as women and other minority populations, to bring their voice into the conference and into the outcomes of COP.
We're going to, Joseph, come to you next, after this, but maybe, Reitumetse, first of all, the National Business Initiative is an organization that really looks at how organizations and business in South Africa is galvanized to work towards common goals and aims in this environment. What do you see as the most actionable initiatives at COP28 this year?
So thank you very much for that question. I think what is clear from this global stocktake already, it's a process that's been a number of years on the go, is that we're not reaching the ambition that we've set out for ourselves. And so our expectation, I think, at a minimum, is that recommitment that we do need to meet at least 1.5 degrees in terms of limiting climate change. We understand the implications and the difference between, limiting it at a higher level, and there's really an imperative for the world to recommit in our different jurisdictions to achieving that net zero goal. We've seen in a number of places at government level, even sometimes at a company level, some of those affirmations around what net zero goals should be in place being rolled back. So it's really critical. We've known for a long time that we are not on the path where we should be. This is really a critical moment, having built it into the negotiations framework itself, that we do need to recommit that that's the route we need to take and still be aiming for net zero by 2050.
Joseph, if I could perhaps come to you on the issues that Reitumetse has just highlighted from the National Business Initiative. When we look at COP28 in terms of the agenda for sustainable finance and climate change being addressed, do you think we'll see better momentum this year?
So the short answer is yes. You mentioned a global stocktake and taking inventory, and that really means just understanding where the gaps are in terms of current national and global ambitions, and finance really greases the wheel to close that gap. This COP28 is slightly different from a finance perspective because the number of attendees from the finance sector is significantly greater than it's ever been before. And I think also this is the first time private finance is really attending with an understanding that embedding sustainability really creates value. So sustainable finance has a critical role to play in driving these low carbon opportunities. I think Arvana mentioned renewables. That will be one of the key themes coming out of COP28 as well, and finance will be supporting, that growth. So I really do see private finance and therefore sustainable finance as one of the dominant themes coming out of COP28.
Okay, so perhaps then moving on to an organization so many people in the world are recognizable in terms of dealing with climate for many, many decades and maybe over the past century. Justin, from the WWF's perspective, what are the priorities at COP28 that you think your organization locally and globally sees at maybe the most important points?
So Gary, I think to start with, this is a climate COP, but it's also the first climate COP since we've had a global biodiversity framework in place, which was agreed at the end of last year. And for WWF, these two massive kind of global challenges, biodiversity loss and climate, are so interconnected. So we hope that some of the momentum that's been developing in the biodiversity space will kind of roll into the climate side as well. And we hope that a lot of the thinking is around interconnected solutions. We want climate finance that also solves for nature loss. We want to make sure that the scaling that I think Arvana spoke about is a reality that comes through in this particular COP as well. So that means really strong commitments from both public and private financial institutions around climate finance, particularly in adaptation, but also in sort of nature-based solutions as part of that conversation. I think we've also seen for so many years that developed economies have not met their commitments in terms of funding the developing economy component where most of the effects of climate impacts are felt. So if we can see the loss and damage fund that was agreed at COP27 actually kick into gear, if we can see some real commitment around the $100 billion a year pledge that's never, I think, been achieved yet, and really doubling financing for adaptation in particular. I think the rate at which we're seeing kind of climate-related disasters happen mean that we have very little wiggle room now. So we need that funding and that adaptation and resilience work to happen as soon as possible as well. And then I think finally, from a kind of regulatory perspective as well, we really need to see financial regulators and central banks, including both nature loss and climate, more effectively in their mandates and concerns as well.
Well, finance, a main theme of not only this COP, but particularly in terms of all the pledging we've seen in the past. Arvana, Nedbank CIB has been a major player in finance, in climate finance in South Africa and the rest of Africa for the past few years. But how do you look at the needs, the now versus the future in terms of finance of climate necessary funding across different industries and different verticals?
Sure. So financing needs and the wider developmental priorities in Africa, in addition to climate, is our focus. And we effectively, for for many years have been rolling out finance in various sectors of the economy, whether that be to key infrastructure areas or via our energy finance teams for energy projects on the continent, and to corporates, and more recently to corporates to help finance their capex plans as relates to green initiatives, etc. And what we do recognize is that climate change is a risk factor on the continent, which is impacting our clients and impacting the entire population. And as such, we've had to progress and adapt our policies and our strategy in that regard. And therefore, in April 2021, we became the first bank in Africa to release an energy policy, which sets out a timely and orderly path for us to effectively wind down our financing towards the fossil fuel sector. And this is in response to being able to support the bringing down of carbon emissions and ultimately, hopefully, contribute positively towards mitigating those risks associated with climate change. In addition to this, we have our sustainable development finance strategy, whereby we intentionally allocate financing that would promote wider societal environmental outcomes. And in 2021, we were at about 108 billion rand, and we've managed to increase that to 123 billion rand in 2022. And we effectively want to grow by 2025 to have 20% of our gross loans and advances allocated towards sustainable development financing activities in the continent. We also engage in a number of product offerings such as green loans and sustainability-linked loans to effectively promote these sustainable outcomes. And we also focused on inclusive financing, where through our motor vehicle finance division, using that particular architecture, we are also able to roll out financing and solar financing to our small businesses as well as individuals.
Reitumetse, from balancing the needs of business, and obviously that's primarily what your organization also needs to do. There is the now and then there is the future. How do you see ensuring sustainable development within the business environment as part of the solutions for a more sustainable green environment going forward that business needs to buy into?
If I can reference the work that the NBI implemented in partnership with BOOS and BCG, and that was really about charting out what the transition pathways would be for the South African economy and taking a sector-specific look at what we need to do to reduce our emissions. And I think if I take a step back from why that work was initiated, we understand the physical impacts of climate change and really that this is a reality that we are dealing with. And it's set to intensify if we're not able to mitigate the emissions. But there's a second component to that, and that's South Africa's vulnerability from an economic perspective to the transitions that we're seeing globally. And what was very clear is that the nature of our economy, but also some of the opportunities that are sitting in the emerging trends that we're seeing globally, indicate that transitioning the South African economy to one that is compatible with net zero is really something that is a good thing for us. It responds to the niche, the opportunities that are emerging in spaces like green hydrogen, leveraging our renewable energy resources and some of the capability that we have on the continent. But it also starts to contribute to reducing our exposure, even on the physical aspect, although that is something that needs to come from more of a global and collective effort. So the reality is transitioning the South African economy, positioning, being very deliberate about the choices that we make, and being able to engage and take up the competitive advantages that we see in a number of different sectors, stands us in good stead to be sustainable, and sustainable on a number of different levels. So resilient in the face of the global drivers of change that we're seeing, but also resilient in terms of being able to respond to climate change and to really leverage the opportunities that we see in the economic space that help our businesses to grow, but also to grow in a way that is inclusive, to grow in a way that reinforces resilience both at an economic level, at a physical level, and in response to climate change. So I think that was work that was well supported by a number of different companies across different sectors. The colleagues from both the colleagues joining us here have been part of that work and have seen that work, and it was something that was embraced by business, just recognizing that in investing for the opportunities and the strengths that we have as a country and being very much aware and responsive to the risks that we are facing that are fast becoming realities, we are setting ourselves up to be far more competitive if we build in sustainability into the processes, into the approaches and the decisions that we are taking as a country, and obviously at a company level as well.
Joseph, if I could come to you on the issue of, and we heard it being mentioned by some of the other panelists, sustainable finance. Over the past few years, the funding promises of global players have really, been just not hitting the target, if one has to, be blunt. But what do you think needs to be done in terms of, and how, in order to build that sustainable finance model that is required to make sure that everybody benefits?
So again, I expect the private sector and private funding to really drive the growth of sustainable finance, and I expect a lot of progress to come out of COP28. What private finance wants to see is the operationalization of the path to net zero and meeting the challenges of 2030 targets. That means companies better understanding their risks. So I expect to see things like new business models, companies looking at what I'd call end-to-end solutions. So understanding their full supply chain. I'd expect to see new finance models. A good example would be blended finance. In South Africa recently, we've had KfW support the IDC with funding for green hydrogen projects, and that kind of blended finance allows private funders to then come in. We also need, just frankly put, more low carbon project opportunities and quality ones, and I think those again will come out of the back of discussions at COP. The NBI hosts the South African delegation, and there'll be a lot of connectivity between South African companies and banks at COP28, and that will allow a lot of transition finance to support some of these initiatives. So I think there are a lot of initiatives which will support the growth of sustainable finance, and again, I think this will be a step up for the growth of sustainable finance, certainly for South African institutions, but more broadly as well.
Justin, if perhaps from the WWF's perspective, how do you see the balance in responsible climate transition? Obviously, if the planet survives, it benefits us all. But there are the current realities, and they are very much, humanity-driven. Versus nature, climate, and where is this balance? How do you see that balance and responsibility when we talk of finance models and also whether it's political or economic will and support for climate action?
Gary, it is a very complex area. There's some, I guess, very basic realities in terms of we're exceeding planetary boundaries at a rate of knots. We've lost almost 70% of ecosystem integrity in the last 50 years. We know that we're hitting a lot of temperature thresholds in the climate space, so those are massive risk issues. And the fact is that our economy and our livelihoods are incredibly dependent on nature in so many ways that we're kind of eroding our own natural capital base while this is happening. So we do need to shift, and we need to shift really, really quickly. But again, in both the climate and biodiversity space, most of the impacts have been caused by developed economies. So our developing economies also need to do their own development activities and social upliftment kind of work that needs to happen. So we've got to get that balance right, that there's funding and support from the developed economies into emerging economies, and then recognize that these just transition pathways in South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, and other countries where work is being done means taking the most vulnerable in society along that journey and reskilling people, understanding that we need to do it in a very well thought out way so we don't lose jobs in countries like our own where job creation is so centrally critical to anything that we do. I think it's also a need to sort of redirect some of the funding and finance we see. We know that there's billions spent on, incentives for fossil fuels, for instance. A difficult and awkward space when the COP is taking place in the UAE, but a reality. So if we redirect some of the current incentives that are causing negative environmental and social consequences, it actually frees up money. We don't need to create new funding. We can actually be clever about that and utilize it more effectively. So those are some of the things we need to see shifts on quite quickly.
Arvana, perhaps then the buzzword has been going around for many years called just transition. How does that relate back to how banks and financial institutions are looking at inclusivity and how just transition happens for organizations and for individuals?
Yes, and it's a really important topic, especially in the context of South Africa. And a just transition effectively would require a move in the system which remains sensitive to the underlying workforce that's underneath that, to ensure that we can redeploy that effectively, and to ultimately ensure a more fair and equitable society post the transition. And basically what some of the banks are doing and what we are doing as a bank is we're collaborating with a number of stakeholders to effectively get to a consensus of what a just transition framework would look like and a financing framework in that regard. And there's been a lot of work being done by the National Business Initiative as well in this regard, as well as the JSC, who recently started a transition segment. But it's really around how can we get to that level of consensus in terms of structural terms that will enable us to be comfortable to label this as a just transition financing mechanism. Secondly, we're also partnering with the likes of the developmental financial institutions in order to be able to blend financing that Joseph spoke about, and to be able to, at the same time, build capacity underneath that, as well as the skills development. An example of this is the Green Residential Development Bond issuance that we concluded as Nedbank in December 2021. We raised 1.09 billion rand under the bond, but in addition to mobilizing the financing, we also have been able to skill our staff in terms of excellence in green design. And we are able to then also transfer those skills to our developers and our clients in the economy and continue to build capacity.
Well, in terms of this balance, Reitumetse, your organization is well known for balancing, two aspects. One is the social impact, and the other one is the environmental impact. What kind of message do you think that you really want, to come from COP and also maybe take to COP in terms of, the preparedness from business to address this?
So I think I would reflect on what I said right at the beginning. We know that South Africa is facing quite a critical energy shortage at the moment, and while we've made commitments in terms of our trajectory towards net zero and net zero compatible pathways, it's been difficult to maintain that position, in the midst of this energy crisis. So one of my big messages would be to be quite clear that in responding to climate change, in responding to the many opportunities that are sitting perhaps first and foremost in this renewable energy space, we are able to respond to multiple challenges that we are facing. So I would like a recommitment, a reaffirmation from business, from our country, that we see that net zero pathway as being key, both on the societal front, because if we're not transitioning our economy, we stand to lose out in terms of the commodities that we export to the markets in which we're active, where our goods may no longer be attractive because of their carbon intensity, and that has implications for jobs. So in the study, we had estimated up to 15% of our GDP being at risk, and there are sectors immediately at risk, from your metals, from your automotives, for example. So there's a very clear social impact there, and we have the means and the mechanisms to be able to address this initial kind of thrust towards net zero from a technological perspective. I would also add that in the work that we had done, and I would like to reference that in that work we worked very closely with business, we aligned with other stakeholders, we anchored the transition in that renewable energy space, but also acknowledged that there is a raft of other measures that need to be implemented. Some of them speak more to our ecosystems, some of them speak to issues around the skilling, the education, understanding how communities are impacted by these massive transitions. So to keep that in mind, but also to acknowledge that we understand the pathways that we need to be implementing as a country. We understand the importance for safeguarding and building our competitiveness going forward, and we understand the means and the mechanisms for including our economy more broadly, for including our societies and really being equitable and just in how we're implementing those transitions. And that's really the message that we need to take to COP. That's the basis for our conversation and engaging with other actors in this multilateral space, but it's something that we need to reaffirm in our own country and respond to the different kind of challenges and the roles that calls on different stakeholders to take up in support of that goal.
So very much a balancing act. Joseph, quickly, if we could touch on how do you see the tangible changes to help change mindsets about climate finance and a just transition over the next few years?
So, I mean, investors want to see value creation opportunities around sustainability. They want to see companies with pathways to net zero. So that means companies that have set carbon inventories, they've got glide paths, targets in place. They have an understanding of just transition, and banks, that have made commitments to net zero fossil fuels, fossil fuel reduction. So Nedbank, is a great case in point. It's made these commitments, and I think all of these the awareness and momentum that you speak about are going to be driven by organizations. Banks in particular have a very big role to play, and banks such as Nedbank are already very active in that space.
We're going to Justin, maybe just finally from the WWF's perspective, what do you see in terms of the balancing between global and local? Because essentially that's also part of what's at play here. We were talking earlier about industrialized nations and developing ones. So in terms of balancing that, what are the main messages?
So, I mean, South Africa is a complex example in that regard, though, because though we're not one of the biggest economies, we are one of the biggest emitters, even though we are a developing economy. So we know we've got an incredibly sophisticated financial sector in South Africa, but a lot of real challenges from a developing economy perspective. So if we can find solutions that work in this country and also learn from solutions that are happening in Asia and Latin America and elsewhere on the continent, I think that's the global, local kind of space that makes the most sense. But realistically, we do need that financial support from the developed economies to be able to implement some of these solutions. We know that the funding gap in the climate finance space is still gigantic. We know that the funding gap in the biodiversity space is enormous as well. And we need that momentum not only from the public institutions and kind of development finance side, but also from banks like Nedbank and counterpart banks on the continent. So it's great to see the commitments that we have so far. But I think to one of Arvana's points earlier, again, we need to see that go at scale, doubling, tripling, quadrupling kind of year on year now.
We're going to have to leave it there. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck in your travels to the United Arab Emirates at the COP28 and flying the South African flag, but also the just transition and climate responsibility flag. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's our COP28 program and our panel discussion for this instance, and how South Africa and the rest of the continent will be looking towards climate conversations at COP28 happening at the United Arab Emirates on between November the 30th and December the 12th in Dubai. You can catch our daily updates on COP28 right here on Business Day TV, DSTV channel 412, and it's in collaboration with Nedbank. And that's where we leave it for now, and enjoy the rest of Business Day TV programming. This special COP28 Insights panel discussion is brought to you in association with Nedbank.
Join the bank that's best for your money. Nedbank. See money differently.